This is Ashe County Fair, created and composed by Mark Stephen Nordlund. Boohousebooks.com. For most of its history, Ashe County had been the sort of place people passed through without noticing. The interstate missed it by nearly 20 miles. Freight traffic preferred larger distribution routes farther south. The railroad depot that had once supported the local economy spent most of the 20th century shrinking in slow, practical stages, until it became little more than a maintenance stop and a weathered brick office. Families remained because their parents had remained, and because the farms, machine shops, feed stores, and small businesses that survived from one generation to the next created just enough gravity to prevent complete abandonment. It was not a dying county, exactly. It simply occupied that vast category of American places that persisted without expectation, growing neither significantly better nor significantly worse, carrying themselves forward through habit more than optimism. The fair changed that. Nobody living in Ashe County could remember a time when the fair had not existed, yet almost no one could explain why it had become so important. The official answer appeared in brochures, tourism websites, and county economic reports. The fair was a beloved regional tradition. It celebrated agriculture, community, and local history. It brought together visitors from across the country and generated millions of dollars in economic activity every year. Those explanations satisfied most people because they were reasonable explanations, and reasonable explanations rarely invite further investigation. The numbers, however, were difficult to ignore. Attendance had increased almost continuously for decades. Recessions barely affected it. Fuel shortages barely affected it. Competing attractions barely affected it. Counties much larger than Ashe struggled to maintain similar events, yet the Ashe County Fair continued expanding as though responding to forces that did not apply elsewhere. New parking lots became necessary every few years. Hotels filled months in advance. Visitors routinely traveled distances that seemed disproportionate to what awaited them. Every year, surveys produced the same strange contradiction. Guests described the experience as unforgettable, while struggling to identify any specific attraction responsible for their enthusiasm. The fair itself was pleasant enough. There were rides, livestock exhibitions, concerts, food vendors, games, craft competitions, and all the other familiar components that could be found at hundreds of county fairs across the country. Nothing about it justified national attention. Nothing about it explained why a family from Oregon might drive across multiple states to attend. Nothing about it explained why a retired couple from New Hampshire would describe the trip as something they had felt compelled to make for years, despite learning about the event only months earlier. Yet people continued coming. They arrived in numbers large enough to reshape the economy of the county itself. By late August, the roads began filling with campers and trailers. Restaurants extended hours. Seasonal employees returned. Temporary fencing appeared around parking lots. Vendors arrived in long convoys carrying rides and equipment that transformed empty fields into a temporary city of lights, music, machinery, and movement. The population of the county effectively doubled during fair season. For 10 days each year, Ashe County became more prosperous than it had any obvious right to be. The fairgrounds occupied nearly 200 acres on the eastern edge of town. Expansion projects over the decades had produced a layered landscape where old sections merged imperfectly with newer construction. Maintenance buildings sat beside structures erected half a century apart. Electrical systems crossed through corridors built during different administrations. Concrete poured in one decade rested directly atop foundations installed in another. The property possessed the accumulated complexity of any place that had been continuously modified by generations of people solving immediate problems without fully considering how their solutions would interact with future ones. Claire Harlan understood this better than most. She had spent nearly her entire life on the grounds. Her grandfather had worked for the fair. Her father had worked for the fair. Family photographs showed her as a child sitting on tractor displays, eating funnel cakes, standing beside prize livestock, and wandering midway corridors while construction crews assembled rides around her. The fair existed in her memory, with the same permanence as seasons or weather. She had never questioned its importance because doing so would have felt similar to questioning the importance of the county itself. Now, at 38, she served as executive director. The position sounded more impressive than it felt. Most days consisted of budgets, permits, staffing concerns, sponsorship negotiations, insurance reviews, and the endless logistical challenges involved in preparing a temporary city for hundreds of thousands of visitors. Success depended less upon vision than maintenance. Problems solved early remained invisible. Problems ignored became emergencies. The week before opening day was traditionally the worst. Her office overlooked a portion of the midway where workers moved between partially assembled rides and stacks of shipping crates. Through the window she could see forklifts crossing service roads, electricians pulling cable, food vendors unloading supplies, and maintenance crews checking systems that would soon operate continuously for 10 days. The activity usually reassured her. This year it produced an uneasiness she struggled to explain. Attendance projections had arrived that morning. Another record, not a small one, a significant one. The increase itself was not impossible. The fair had grown steadily for decades. What bothered her was the geographic distribution. Visitors were traveling from farther away than ever before. The pattern appeared throughout reservation data, online ticket sales, and tourism reports. Attendance from neighboring counties had stabilized years ago. Growth now came from increasingly distant regions. The fair was expanding outward. Not physically, influentially. The realization lingered with her throughout the afternoon, while she reviewed reports and answered emails. By itself, the trend meant nothing. Successful attractions often broadened their reach over time. Yet she found herself repeatedly returning to the numbers, studying them as though some hidden irregularity remained just beyond recognition. The interruption arrived shortly after sunset. At first, it appeared to be a routine maintenance issue. Equipment failures occurred constantly during preparation week. Claire barely glanced at the notification when it appeared in her inbox. A vibration alarm beneath the Ferris wheel had triggered unexpectedly. A mechanic had been dispatched. Further updates would follow if necessary. She would not think about the message again until nearly an hour later, when her office phone rang. The call came from the county sheriff. As she listened, the familiar landscape outside her office window seemed to shift subtly, acquiring a quality she would later struggle to describe. Nothing visible changed. Workers continued moving through the grounds. Generators continued humming. Construction continued exactly as before. Yet the fair suddenly felt less like an event under construction and more like something being observed from a considerable distance, as though the ordinary activity visible outside represented only the surface of a much larger process occurring beyond immediate perception. A body had been discovered beneath the midway. The words themselves were alarming, but not extraordinary. Accidents happened. Medical emergencies happened. Large public venues occasionally became entangled in tragedies they could neither predict nor prevent. Then, the sheriff explained where the body had been found. Buried. Not completely. Partially exposed within a maintenance corridor beneath the Ferris wheel. The detail unsettled her in a way she could not immediately articulate. Because people did not accidentally become buried inside utility tunnels, and because somewhere beneath the practical concerns of public relations, law enforcement, and liability management, another thought had begun forming. Faint but persistent, like a memory struggling toward consciousness. The fairgrounds were older than most people realized, and nobody truly knew what existed beneath them. The tunnel sat nearly 20 feet beneath the midway. Claire had spent decades above it without ever seeing it. Like most people who worked the fairgrounds, she understood the existence of maintenance corridors in an abstract way. Electrical systems required access. Water lines required access. Communication cables required access. Large properties accumulated infrastructure beneath the surface, just as cities accumulated it beneath streets. She had signed budgets involving tunnel repairs, reviewed engineering reports referencing tunnel repairs, and approved tunnel inspections without ever feeling any particular curiosity about the spaces themselves. Standing inside one proved unexpectedly unsettling. The corridor seemed less like part of the fairgrounds than part of something the fairgrounds had gradually buried. The concrete walls reflected several generations of construction practices. Fresh conduit brackets sat beside rusted pipe supports. Sections of wall changed texture abruptly where expansion projects had joined older structures. Certain portions appeared almost improvised, as though crews from previous decades had encountered obstacles and simply built around them rather than understanding them. County investigators continued documenting the scene while Claire followed Sheriff Donnelly farther down the corridor. The body had already been removed. Only the disturbed earth remained. A rough mound of loose soil spread across the floor beside the excavation area. Floodlights revealed subtle variations in color and composition that immediately distinguished it from the surrounding environment. It did not belong there. The tunnel had existed for years. The floor was sealed concrete, yet several cubic yards of earth now occupied the space, as though it had been pushed upward from somewhere below. "You're sure nobody dug in from the surface?" Claire asked. Donnelly shook his head. "Surface is intact. We checked before you arrived." She looked back towards the mound. The explanation should have been straightforward. Every problem eventually yielded to a practical explanation. That belief formed the foundation of her professional life. Budgets, permits, staffing shortages, equipment failures. Every challenge looked overwhelming until enough information reduced it to a series of manageable decisions. The soil resisted that process. The sight of it produced an irrational discomfort she could not quite dismiss. The mound looked wrong, in the same way a broken bone looked wrong. Something fundamental about its presence violated expectation. An investigator crouched near the excavation area while photographing marks exposed beneath the displaced earth. "What are those?" Claire asked. The man glanced up. "Not sure." He stepped aside. The marks extended across the concrete floor in parallel rows, each groove several inches deep. Claire initially assumed excavation equipment had produced them, until she realized portions of the pattern disappeared beneath intact sections of flooring. The scratches predated the exposed concrete. Whatever had created them had been present before that portion of the tunnel existed. The realization settled heavily in her stomach. "How old is this section?" she asked. "Early 90s, the investigator replied. "You're sure?" "That's what the plans say." Claire stared at the grooves. The marks continued beneath concrete poured before she entered high school. Somehow that detail disturbed her more than the body, because a body represented an event. The scratches represented duration. Something had been there before the tunnel, before the renovation, possibly before the previous renovation. The thought followed her home. Sleep arrived late and disappeared early. By sunrise, she sat alone at her kitchen table, reviewing historical attendance reports stored in the county archive database. The work possessed no obvious connection to the previous night's discovery, yet she found herself returning repeatedly to the same material. Numbers felt safer than speculation. Numbers behaved predictably. If anxiety demanded an outlet, statistics provided one. The attendance records stretched back decades. The trend remained astonishing. Year after year, the fair expanded regardless of circumstances that should have interrupted growth. Economic downturns reduced attendance briefly before growth resumed. Competing attractions emerged and faded. Demographic changes affected neighboring counties far more severely than Ashe. Yet the fair continued attracting larger crowds from increasingly distant locations. Claire had examined the numbers many times throughout her career. This morning she viewed them differently. Not as evidence of success, as evidence of influence. The distinction seemed subtle at first. Then she opened the geographic reports. The pattern became impossible to ignore. In the 1960s, most visitors originated within a 100-mile radius. By the 1980s, that radius had expanded significantly. By the early 2000s, attendance growth increasingly came from out-of-state travelers. Recent projections showed another shift underway. Visitors now arrived from regions with no cultural connection to Ashe County whatsoever. Large numbers discovered the fair through indirect recommendations rather than direct advertising. The fair's reach was growing faster than its marketing efforts. The observation should have pleased her. Instead, it reminded her of something biological. Like watching the territory of an invasive species expand across a map. Claire closed the laptop. The comparison irritated her. She was tired. That was all. A dead body had been discovered beneath her workplace. Naturally, her thoughts were drifting toward unpleasant interpretations. Still, the feeling persisted. By mid-morning, she found herself driving towards the county courthouse. The archives occupied a neglected basement room few people visited voluntarily. Old property records, engineering documents, meeting minutes, construction plans, and local newspapers filled rows of shelving that smelled faintly of paper dust and mildew. Most of the collection had been digitized, but decades of material remained available only in physical form. Claire requested every major fairgrounds construction file she could find. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Planning a renovation?" "Just looking into something." The answer satisfied neither of them. An hour later, she sat alone at a long wooden table surrounded by stacks of aging documents. The first few folders proved disappointingly mundane. Drainage improvements, electrical upgrades, parking expansions, vendor permits, thousands of small decisions that collectively transformed a county fair into a regional institution. Then she found the cavity reports. The phrase appeared repeatedly. Subsurface cavity, ground instability, unexpected void, soil collapse. The dates varied: 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945. Each report described a different incident. Each report recommended further geological investigation, and each recommendation ended the same way: deferred, postponed, budgetary concerns, construction deadlines, insufficient evidence. The language changed from decade to decade while the outcome remained remarkably consistent. Do not investigate. Build anyway. Claire turned another page. A black and white photograph slid loose from the folder. The image showed several workers standing beside an excavation pit somewhere on the fairgrounds. The photograph quality was poor, but the shape visible behind them immediately caught her attention. A dark opening descended beneath the edge of the frame, large enough for construction equipment to enter. Someone had written a date on the back: 1942. The same year as the earliest cavity report. She studied the photograph for a long time. The workers looked nervous, not frightened, uncomfortable. as though standing beside something they did not entirely understand. For the first time since discovering the body, Claire felt the faint outline of a larger pattern emerging around the edges of her understanding. Not a conclusion, not even a theory. Merely the sense that generations of people had encountered the same anomaly and responded in exactly the same way. They had looked at it, acknowledged it, then chosen to continue building. Outside, preparations for opening day continued across the fairgrounds. Workers assembled rides, vendors stocked supplies. Thousands of visitors would begin arriving within weeks. Another record attendance year appeared almost certain. Yet as Claire stared at the photograph, she found herself wondering whether the fair's greatest achievement had never been attracting people. Perhaps its greatest achievement had been convincing generations of otherwise practical people not to ask questions. The notebook appeared by accident. Claire discovered it near the bottom of a cardboard archive box, whose contents seemed unrelated to anything she was investigating. Most of the material consisted of maintenance reports, correspondence, and handwritten notes from long-retired county employees. The box itself had apparently been assembled by someone attempting to clear storage space rather than preserve historical records. Documents from different decades sat mixed together without any obvious organizational system. The notebook almost remained unnoticed. Its cover was stained and partially detached, and several pages had warped from moisture exposure years earlier. No official label identified it. No archival tag referenced it. Someone had simply placed it in the box and forgotten about it. Inside, however, every page carried the same name: Henry Pike, the groundskeeper from the first generation. Claire recognized the name only because it appeared repeatedly throughout old maintenance records she had reviewed earlier that afternoon. Pike had worked the fairgrounds for decades and seemed to have developed a habit of documenting observations no one else considered important. The early entries were mundane: weather patterns, equipment failures, vendor complaints, livestock incidents. The daily texture of fair operations viewed through the eyes of a man responsible for keeping the grounds functional. Then, gradually, the tone changed. Not dramatically. Not enough to suggest instability. Simply enough to reveal a growing concern. Dogs continue avoiding center midway after closing. Horse incident repeated tonight. 3 separate animals refused crossing. Ground vibration felt again approximately 20 minutes after midnight. The entries remained practical despite their unusual subject matter. Pike did not speculate. He did not attempt explanations. He simply recorded observations the way another worker might record maintenance concerns. As Claire continued reading, she began noticing a pattern. Many of the observations centered around the same location: the middle of the midway, the oldest section of the property, the area directly above the cavity discovered during the 1942 excavation. One entry from September of 1948 occupied nearly an entire page. Fair closed at 11. Remained on grounds until approximately 1 in the morning collecting trash and securing gates. Noticed unusual vibration while standing near Central Food Court. Similar sensation to train approaching from distance. No audible source identified. Ground itself appeared responsible. Vibration continued intermittently for several minutes before stopping. Livestock in holding barns became agitated during same period. Claire reread the passage twice. The description matched reports she had encountered elsewhere. Ground vibrations, animal reactions, localized disturbances, separated by decades. The same symptoms recurring repeatedly. A strange thought occurred to her. What if nobody had ignored the pattern? What if everyone had noticed it? The record suggested exactly that. Engineers noticed, groundskeepers noticed, construction crews noticed, maintenance workers noticed. The pattern was not hidden, the pattern was tolerated. Each generation observed the same anomalies and made the same calculation. The fair generated prosperity. The anomalies generated uncertainty. Prosperity won every time. The realization unsettled her more than any theory involving caves or sinkholes, because it implied participation, not conspiracy, something simpler and far more common. People choosing not to look too closely at something useful. By late afternoon, she had accumulated a small stack of documents beside her. Construction reports, soil assessments, incident records, notebook entries. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they created the outline of a history the county had never formally acknowledged. Then, she found the map. The folded sheet appeared inside a tube labeled Fairground Expansion, 1989. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. Utility routes, maintenance corridors, electrical systems, drainage channels. The sort of technical document produced during every major construction project. Then Claire noticed a series of red circles. Someone had drawn them by hand. The markings highlighted locations spanning nearly 50 years of development. Sinkholes, ground collapses, excavation discoveries, subsurface voids. As she studied the map, a realization settled over her with increasing certainty. The incidents were not random. The locations formed a pattern. The circles traced an enormous shape beneath the fairgrounds. Not perfectly. Not enough to prove anything. Enough to suggest something. The shape widened beneath the oldest portions of the property before narrowing into several branching corridors that extended outward beneath newer construction. The configuration reminded her of roots, or blood vessels, or tunnels. She stared at the map for several minutes before noticing a notation written along the bottom margin. The handwriting differed from the engineering notes elsewhere on the page. Smaller, personal, almost hidden. Growth appears directional. No signature followed. No explanation accompanied it. Just those 3 words. Growth appears directional. Claire felt an unpleasant tightening in her chest. Because caves did not grow. Sinkholes did not grow. Geological formations changed over long periods of time, but they did not expand through a property with apparent purpose, unless the person who wrote the note had been mistaken, or unless the thing beneath the fairgrounds was not geological at all. The thought arrived so suddenly she almost laughed at herself. It sounded absurd. A conclusion reached too quickly from too little evidence. Yet once the possibility entered her mind, she found it increasingly difficult to dismiss. Her phone rang before she could examine the map further. The call came from Sheriff Donnelly. His voice sounded different. Not frightened. Disturbed. The distinction mattered. Fear belonged to emergencies. Disturbance belonged to facts. "We found another one," he said. For several seconds, Claire did not understand. Then she did. The body beneath the midway had not been an isolated discovery. The silence that followed stretched long enough for her to hear activity in the background. Voices, vehicle engines, radios. "Where?" she asked. "A service corridor beneath the livestock barns." The answer produced an immediate physical reaction, not shock. Recognition. The corridor sat nearly half a mile from the first location. Too far away for coincidence. Too far away for a single hidden grave. Too far away for any explanation she currently possessed. "We're going to need you out here," Donnelly said. Claire looked down at the map spread across the archive table, at the red circles, at the branching pattern, at the handwritten note. Growth appears directional. Outside the courthouse, preparations for the fair continued beneath a warm evening sky. Trucks moved through town. Vendors checked into hotels. Families planned trips they had been anticipating for months. And for the first time since beginning her investigation, Claire found herself wondering whether the fair's greatest danger was not something hidden beneath it. Perhaps the danger was that whatever existed below had been changing for decades, and nobody had noticed because every year it gave them exactly what they wanted. The second body altered the atmosphere of the fairgrounds in ways no official statement could acknowledge. Preparations continued. Deliveries arrived. Contractors completed schedules. Vendors stocked inventory. Yet beneath the surface efficiency of those activities, Claire sensed a subtle shift moving through employees who had learned of the discovery. People spoke more quietly. Conversations ended when supervisors approached. Maintenance workers who normally joked through 12-hour shifts now seemed distracted by thoughts they preferred not to articulate. The county could survive one body. One tragedy could be explained. Two bodies created a pattern. Patterns made people nervous. By the time Claire arrived at the livestock corridor, floodlights had already transformed the area into a temporary crime scene. Sheriff's deputies stood near tunnel entrances, while investigators moved equipment through the access stairwell. The smell reached her before she descended. Not decomposition this time. Fresh earth. The same smell she remembered from the photographs. The same smell she remembered from the first tunnel. She followed Donnelly downward. The corridor beneath the livestock barns differed from the one beneath the midway. This section had been constructed more recently and lacked the layered quality of the older tunnels. The walls appeared cleaner, the lighting brighter, the infrastructure more orderly. Yet the disturbance occupying the center of the passage looked disturbingly familiar. Soil covered the floor. Not scattered, deposited. A mound of dark earth had emerged through fractured concrete, spreading outward across the corridor like material forced upward under pressure. Investigators had already begun excavation around the edges. Portable lights illuminated exposed sections of broken flooring and compacted soil beneath. The body itself had been removed. Only photographs remained. Donnelly handed her a tablet. Claire looked. A middle-aged man. Unknown identity. Partially buried. The same expression. Confusion. Not terror. Not pain. Confusion. She handed the device back immediately. "What are we looking at?" she asked. Donnelly rubbed his forehead. "I was hoping you might tell me." The answer surprised her. Sheriffs usually possessed theories. Law enforcement depended upon theories. Evidence pointed somewhere. Motive explained behavior. Even uncertainty generally arrived wrapped inside a working explanation. Donnelly sounded exhausted, not uncertain. Overwhelmed. "Two unrelated bodies in different parts of the property," he said. "No clear point of entry, no obvious burial mechanism, no connection to each other, no connection to the county. Both were reported missing months ago." "Months?" He nodded. "Different states." The implications settled heavily between them. Missing persons from different states. Discovered beneath the fairgrounds, months after disappearance. Claire found herself thinking about attendance maps, distances, travel patterns, the expanding radius. The thought felt irrational enough that she immediately suppressed it. People did not travel across the country to become buried beneath county fairs. Yet the statistics she had reviewed earlier that day continued resurfacing in her mind. People were traveling farther. People were arriving in greater numbers. People frequently struggled to explain why. A deputy approached carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside sat a rusted object coated in dirt. Donnelly frowned. "What is it?" "Ticket stub." The deputy held up the bag. Claire stared at it. The paper had deteriorated badly, but portions of the printed design remained visible beneath the soil. Ashe County Fair, 1987. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The deputy broke the silence. "Found it under the floor." Claire looked toward the excavation area. Under the floor. Not within the mound. Not near the body. Beneath the tunnel itself. A ticket stub from nearly 40 years ago. The implications arrived slowly. Then all at once. The soil had not come from nearby. The soil had come from deeper, far deeper. The corridor fell silent around her as another possibility emerged. What if the bodies were not being buried? What if they were being brought upward? The thought produced an immediate chill. Not because it was plausible, because it explained something. The mounds, the soil, the fractured concrete, the repeated appearance of material from below. A burial suggested someone placing bodies into the earth. This looked increasingly like the opposite, something moving them towards the surface. She almost shared the thought, then stopped herself. The idea sounded insane, and yet the alternative explanations were rapidly becoming worse. That night, Claire returned to the archives. The courthouse basement had emptied hours earlier, leaving her alone among rows of shelving illuminated by fluorescent lights that hummed softly above the aisles. Outside, darkness settled over the county while fairground crews continued preparing for opening day. Through the narrow basement windows, she occasionally saw vehicle headlights moving through town. Everyone was preparing for the largest fair in county history. The phrase now felt less celebratory than it had that morning. She spread the map across the table again. The red circles, the cavities, the sinkholes, the collapses, the discoveries. One by one, she plotted the locations of both bodies. Then she added several historical disappearances from Henry Pike's notebook. Then a handful of incidents described in old newspaper articles. When she finally leaned back, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The events clustered around the oldest sections of the property. Not randomly, progressively. The distribution suggested movement, expansion, territory. The realization reminded her of wildlife maps produced by state conservation agencies. Population ranges expanded outward from breeding centers. New growth radiated from established territory. Animals colonized landscapes through recognizable geographic patterns. The fairgrounds map now resembled exactly that kind of document. A habitat map. The thought arrived quietly. Not as a conclusion, as a question. What if every engineer had misidentified the problem? What if the cavities were not cavities? What if the tunnels were not tunnels? What if generations of people had spent decades interpreting biological structures as geological ones because geology was easier to accept? Claire stared at the map until another memory surfaced unexpectedly. She opened the notebook. Henry Pike's final entries occupied only a few pages. The handwriting had deteriorated noticeably by then. The letters appeared shakier, the observations shorter. Yet one passage stood out from the rest. The vibration is stronger now, not louder, closer. Livestock know before people do. Dogs know before livestock. Something beneath the grounds responds to crowds. Fair Week changes it. Every year there is more movement afterward. Claire read the passage twice, then 3 times. The sentence that bothered her most was not the final one. It was the simplest. Fair Week changes it. The phrase carried the casual certainty of long observation, not speculation, not fear, recognition. Henry Pike had not believed the fair was occurring above something. He had believed the fair was affecting something. Outside, beyond the courthouse walls, the fairgrounds glowed against the darkness. Floodlights illuminated rides still under construction. Machinery moved through parking lots. Thousands of tons of equipment, wiring, steel, concrete, food, livestock, music, generators, lights, and human activity were converging upon the property once again. For the first time, Claire found herself looking at the fair not as an event, not even as a business, but as a process. A process that had been repeating every year for nearly a century, and processes, unlike mysteries, existed for a reason. The question keeping her awake long after midnight was no longer what might exist beneath the fairgrounds. The question was what the fair had been doing to it all these years. The answer arrived through livestock records. Claire did not discover it because she was searching for animals. She found it because she had exhausted nearly every other category of information available to her. Construction reports led to more construction reports. Geological assessments led to deferred investigations. Missing person cases ended in uncertainty. Eventually, she began examining anything that might reveal a pattern extending beyond the obvious. Livestock incident reports occupied 3 filing cabinets. Most were exactly what she expected: escaped animals, injuries, equipment failures, veterinary concerns. Yet the farther she moved backward through the decades, the more frequently certain observations appeared. Animals refusing to cross particular sections of the grounds, animals becoming agitated after closing, animals attempting to break restraints during overnight hours. The reports came from different eras and different employees, yet they described remarkably similar behavior. One veterinarian from the 1970s had written a note she found especially troubling. No signs of illness. No environmental explanation identified. Animals appear responsive to stimulus not perceived by handlers. Another report from 1989 described an incident in which 6 horses simultaneously attempted to force their way out of a holding barn shortly after midnight. The animals injured themselves repeatedly against gates and fencing before eventually calming. Investigators found no evidence of predators, loud noises, weather disturbances, or equipment malfunctions. The event had been categorized as unexplained. Claire began arranging reports chronologically across a long table. By dawn, a pattern had emerged. The incidents increased dramatically during fair season. More specifically, they increased as attendance increased. The relationship was imperfect but unmistakable. The larger the crowds became, the more severe the animal reactions became. She stared at the documents while a thought slowly formed. The fair wasn't attracting the creature. The creature already lived there. The fair was changing its behavior. The distinction felt important. Profoundly important. For nearly a century, everyone had assumed the fair and the anomalies existed side by side. One happened above ground, the other happened below. What if they were part of the same system? The idea followed her into the parking lot as morning sunlight spread across the courthouse lawn. For the first time since beginning her investigation, Claire found herself thinking less about the dead and more about the living. Specifically, the crowds, hundreds of thousands of people, music, generators, ride motors, public address systems, foot traffic, vibration, movement, energy. A county fair was not simply a gathering. It was an enormous concentration of biological and mechanical activity, and it happened in exactly the same location every year. The realization remained with her throughout the day. By afternoon, she had convinced herself she needed to see the oldest sections of the property firsthand. Not the midway, not the attractions, the ground itself. The decision felt irrational, but so had most of the previous 48 hours. She called Travis Boone, the mechanic who had discovered the first body. An hour later, they stood near a maintenance entrance hidden behind a row of storage buildings at the edge of the property. "You ever been all the way down?" she asked. Travis hesitated. The reaction answered the question before he spoke. There isn't really an all the way down. Claire looked at him. What does that mean? He shifted uncomfortably. The maps aren't complete. Not complete how? The tunnels don't always match. For a moment she thought he was joking. Then she realized he wasn't. The old sections, he continued. Things get weird down there. You'll be following a blueprint and find a corridor that shouldn't exist. Dead ends where there aren't supposed to be dead ends. Maintenance crews mark things, then somebody comes back a year later and the measurements don't line up. Claire frowned. That doesn't make sense. I know. Neither spoke for several seconds. The fairgrounds stretched behind them beneath a bright afternoon sky. Workers moved between attractions. Vendors prepared displays. Families would begin arriving in a matter of days. Everything looked normal. Everything looked successful. Everything looked safe. The contrast made the conversation feel absurd. Why hasn't anyone reported this? She asked. Travis laughed quietly. Not because the question was funny, because it wasn't. People have. The answer landed heavily. Repeatedly. He glanced towards the fairgrounds. Look, I've worked here 12 years. My father worked here before me. Everybody notices something eventually. Strange measurements, strange noises, weird maintenance issues. Then you get busy. Projects come up, deadlines happen, the fair opens, life moves on. Claire thought about Henry Pike, about Frank Harlan, about every report buried in every archive box. Everyone notices, nobody investigates. The pattern was beginning to feel less accidental. Not because people were hiding something, because the fair constantly provided reasons to stop looking. A radio call interrupted them. One of the tunnel crews needed assistance several hundred yards away. Travis apologized and headed towards the service road. Claire remained standing alone beside the entrance. The maintenance door sat partially open. Darkness waited beyond it. A practical part of her mind suggested returning to the office. There were meetings scheduled. Reporters were asking questions about the bodies. Vendors required approvals. Real problems demanded attention. Instead, she descended the stairs. The air cooled immediately. Concrete replaced sunlight. The sounds of construction above faded behind layers of earth and infrastructure. She followed the corridor deeper into the property. The tunnel lighting was functional but uneven. Pools of brightness alternated with stretches of shadow where fixtures had not yet been upgraded. Pipes and conduits lined the walls. Occasional directional signs pointed toward electrical rooms, storage areas, and utility access points. Nothing appeared unusual. At first. Then she noticed the floor, not the condition. The slope. The corridor was descending. Very gradually. So gradually she had not recognized it immediately. Yet after several minutes, she realized she had traveled much farther downward than the surface geography should have allowed. The fairground sat on relatively flat land. There was no reason for the tunnel to continue descending. She stopped, looked behind her, then ahead. The corridor stretched onward, silent, empty, A faint vibration touched the soles of her shoes. The sensation lasted only a second, perhaps less, yet it felt unmistakably familiar. Not because she had experienced it before, because she had read about it. Henry Pike, 1948. The vibration is stronger now. Claire remained perfectly still. The feeling came again. Subtle, rhythmic, almost too faint to notice. For a moment she thought it might be machinery. Then she realized the pulses possessed an irregular quality that machinery rarely produced. The rhythm reminded her of something biological. A pause, another pulse. A longer pause, another. The realization arrived before she wanted it to. The sensation felt disturbingly similar to standing beside the chest of a sleeping animal. Far away. Enormously far away. Yet somehow connected through the earth itself. Claire suddenly became aware that she did not know how deep the tunnel system extended. She did not know where the old cavities were located. She did not know what existed beneath the concrete surrounding her. And for the first time since this investigation began, she experienced genuine fear. Not fear of a killer, not fear of a scandal. Fear that generations of people had mistaken a living thing for part of the landscape, and that the thing itself might be far larger than anyone had imagined. Claire did not tell anyone about the vibration. The decision troubled her during the drive home, though she suspected the outcome would have been the same regardless. There was no practical way to describe what she had experienced without sounding irrational. A faint sensation through concrete. A rhythm she could not prove existed. An impression shaped as much by old notebooks and archive reports as by anything objectively measurable. The sheriff needed evidence. Engineers needed measurements. County officials needed explanations. Claire possessed none of those things. What she possessed instead was an increasingly uncomfortable conviction that the fairgrounds were not merely built above something. They were interacting with it. It transformed the problem from geography into behavior. A sinkhole did not respond. A cave did not respond. An underground animal, however, might. That evening she sat at her dining room table surrounded by photocopies and photographs gathered from the archives. The map remained spread across the center of the table. Henry Pike's notebook sat open beside it. Construction reports formed uneven stacks around her laptop. Outside, summer insects filled the darkness with a steady electrical hum, while distant traffic drifted occasionally through open windows. The county looked peaceful. Most places do before people learn how to interpret them. Claire enlarged one of the attendance maps on her screen. Then another. Then another. The progression spanned decades. She compared them side by side. A strange realization emerged. Everyone had been studying the wrong trend. Attendance numbers attracted attention because numbers were easy to measure. More visitors meant more revenue. More revenue meant more growth. Entire careers had been built around maximizing those outcomes. Nobody had examined timing. Claire opened another file. Historical attendance data stretched backward nearly 70 years. She began charting opening day traffic patterns, ticket sales, crowd density measurements, and visitor arrival times. The work consumed hours. By midnight, she discovered something. The largest attendance spikes did not occur during the fair itself. They occurred before it. People arrived earlier every decade. At first, the change seemed insignificant, a few extra visitors arriving a day ahead of schedule. Then 2 days, then 3. Campgrounds filled earlier. Hotel reservations shifted earlier. Traffic increased earlier. The effect compounded over generations. Visitors were being drawn towards the county before the event had fully begun. Claire stared at the graphs. A thought surfaced immediately. If people were responding primarily to advertising, scheduling, and event planning, their behavior should cluster around opening day. Instead, the attraction appeared to be spreading beyond the boundaries of the fair itself, as though anticipation had become detached from the event that supposedly created it. The implication lingered with her long after she shut down the computer. The third body appeared 48 hours later. This one was alive. Barely. A maintenance crew discovered the man wandering near an abandoned service road at the eastern edge of the property shortly before sunrise. He was dehydrated, disoriented, and unable to explain how he had arrived there. Sheriff's deputies initially assumed drugs or mental illness played a role until investigators identified him. The man had been missing for nearly 7 months. The case originated in Missouri. His family had long since stopped expecting a resolution. Claire arrived at the hospital shortly before noon. The sheriff met her outside. He keeps asking the same question. What question? Donnelly hesitated. Did it stop singing? The answer settled unpleasantly between them. Claire felt the familiar tightening in her stomach. That's exactly what he says? Over and over. They entered together. The patient occupied a private room near the end of a corridor. He appeared older than the photographs circulated during the missing person investigation. Weight loss had sharpened his features. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. The expression on his face carried the exhausted confusion of someone attempting to reconcile incompatible memories. When Claire entered, he looked toward her immediately, not with recognition, with relief. Did it stop? He asked. His voice sounded raw. The question emerged almost automatically. Claire pulled a chair beside the bed. What stopped? The man's eyes shifted towards the window. For a moment she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he spoke. The fair. The word seemed to embarrass him. He lowered his gaze. I know how that sounds. Neither Claire nor the sheriff responded. The silence encouraged him. It wasn't music, he continued. That's what everybody keeps asking. It wasn't music. What was it? The man rubbed his forehead. His frustration appeared genuine, not theatrical, not manipulative. The frustration of someone unable to translate an experience into language. I don't know. The answer arrived almost as a whisper. It felt familiar. Claire remained motionless. The room suddenly felt smaller. Familiar how? He stared at the blanket covering his legs. "When you're driving home." The response made no sense. He noticed her expression. He whispered, "You know when you're driving home after a long trip? The closer you get, the easier everything feels. You stop checking directions. You stop thinking about where you're going. You just know you're almost there." His breathing quickened. That's what it felt like. Claire exchanged a brief glance with Donnelly. Neither interrupted. The man continued. "I kept thinking there was something I was supposed to remember. Every day it felt stronger. Every week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Then eventually I just got in my truck." "To come here?" He nodded. Tears appeared unexpectedly in his eyes. The reaction seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. "I don't even like fairs." The statement hung in the room. Absurd. Simple. Terrifying, because Claire believed him. She believed him completely. The man had driven hundreds of miles toward a county fair he did not care about because something had convinced him it mattered. Not intellectually, emotionally, instinctively. The same way migrating animals followed routes they had never previously traveled. The same way salmon returned to rivers they had never seen. The same way certain species moved toward signals encoded somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Claire left the hospital with a growing certainty she no longer wanted. The fair was not attracting visitors. The fair was not even the source of the attraction. It was merely the visible part of the process, the billboard, the excuse, the human explanation attached to something much older. Something beneath the property had been calling for decades, and each year more people seemed capable of hearing it. That evening she unfolded the map again. The red circles, the cavities, the tunnels, the old reports. This time her attention settled on a detail she had previously overlooked. The earliest incidents clustered tightly around the center of the grounds. The newest incidents extended much farther outward. The territory was expanding. Not rapidly, not dramatically. Patiently. The way roots expand. The way colonies expand, the way living things expand when conditions are favorable. Outside her window, floodlights illuminated portions of the fairgrounds against the darkness. Crews continued working through the evening, preparing for the arrival of hundreds of thousands of guests. Traffic moved steadily through town. Hotels reported near-capacity reservations. Local news stations celebrated another record-breaking year. The county viewed the coming week as a success. Claire found herself wondering whether success and danger had become the same thing. And beneath the oldest section of the midway, far below concrete, steel, utility tunnels, and nearly a century of construction, the slow, rhythmic vibration continued. Not louder. Not stronger. Closer. The fair opened on a Friday. By noon, the county's population had effectively doubled. Traffic backed up for miles along every major approach road. Campgrounds filled ahead of schedule. Shuttle buses ran continuously between remote parking areas and the main gates. Vendors reported strong sales before lunchtime. Local news stations broadcast cheerful segments celebrating another successful opening day, while drone footage captured the sprawling fairgrounds shimmering beneath late summer sunlight. To everyone watching from the outside, the fair appeared healthy, thriving, alive. Claire found the word increasingly difficult to hear. She spent most of the morning moving between meetings, inspections, and media obligations, while attempting to suppress the growing sense that she was witnessing a process she no longer understood. Every conversation seemed to contain an uncomfortable double meaning. Attendance numbers, crowd density, visitor flow, attraction rates, growth projections. For years, those terms had belonged exclusively to economics. Now they sounded biological. The thought followed her through the midway. Thousands of people moved between rides, food vendors, livestock exhibitions, and performance stages. Children ran ahead of parents. Teenagers gathered in clusters beneath bright signage. Elderly couples wandered slowly through agricultural displays. The crowd looked exactly as it should, yet Claire found herself studying faces, not searching for danger, searching for intent. What had brought these people here? The question seemed increasingly difficult to answer. A family from Arizona paused near an information booth. A retired couple from Vermont purchased tickets. A group of college students from Minnesota stood in line for a ride. The distances no longer felt normal. The fair should have been important to the region, not the country. And yet every year the radius expanded. Every year the pull seemed stronger. The realization remained abstract until shortly after 3 p.m. That was when she saw the woman standing completely still. The crowd flowed around her. People brushed past her shoulders. Children nearly collided with her. Yet she remained motionless near the center of the midway, staring toward the oldest section of the grounds. At first, Claire assumed she was waiting for someone. Then she noticed the expression. Not confusion, not distraction. Recognition. The woman looked like someone listening to a familiar voice. Claire approached carefully. "Ma'am?" The woman blinked. The spell seemed to break instantly. She looked around, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said. "What happened?" The woman laughed nervously. "Nothing." The answer arrived too quickly. Claire recognized it immediately. People often responded that way when they could not explain their own behavior. "You were standing here a while." "I know." Again, the embarrassed smile. "I guess I got distracted." By what? The question almost escaped before Claire stopped herself. The woman wouldn't know. That was the problem. Nobody knew. Claire watched her disappear into the crowd. For several moments she remained standing exactly where the woman had been. Then she felt it. Not a sound, not a vibration, a sensation. Brief, subtle. A strange emotional pressure difficult to separate from her own thoughts. For the smallest fraction of a second, she experienced an overwhelming certainty that something important existed nearby. Not danger, not fear, importance. The feeling vanished immediately, yet its absence felt almost as noticeable as its presence. Claire stood frozen, because she finally understood something about the missing man in the hospital. The attraction was not compelling. It was inviting. That made it far more dangerous. People resisted commands. People questioned fear. People rarely questioned longing. The first attack occurred after sunset. The call reached Claire shortly before 9. A maintenance worker had gone missing near the eastern service roads. Unlike previous incidents, this disappearance happened in real time. Witnesses existed. Several employees reported seeing the man enter a restricted utility corridor behind a livestock structure. Minutes later, another worker followed him inside after realizing he had failed to respond over the radio. The corridor was empty. His flashlight remained on the ground. His radio continued transmitting. The man himself had vanished. Claire arrived alongside sheriff's deputies less than 20 minutes later. The tunnel entrance sat behind a row of temporary storage trailers. Beyond the doorway, a narrow concrete passage descended beneath the fairgrounds. Deputies searched the area while maintenance personnel waited nearby. Everyone appeared unsettled, not frightened, not yet. The difference mattered. Fear required understanding. Nobody understood what they were afraid of. One of the workers approached Donnelly. He wasn't alone. The sheriff turned. What do you mean? The man hesitated. Claire recognized the expression immediately. The reluctance of someone who understood how ridiculous his statement would sound. I thought there was another employee down there. The worker pointed toward the tunnel. Ahead of him. What employee? I don't know. The man swallowed. I couldn't see it clearly. Claire felt a cold pressure settle in her stomach. What did you see? The worker stared toward the darkness. For several seconds, he seemed uncertain whether to answer. Then he did. Honestly? Nobody spoke. It looked too big. The tunnel entrance suddenly felt very small. The worker continued. I only saw it for a second. It crossed one of the intersections farther down. I figured it was somebody moving equipment. His voice had become noticeably quieter. Then I realized the ceiling wasn't high enough. Silence followed. Nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed him, because everyone present understood the same thing. The worker was not inventing a story. He genuinely believed what he had seen. Donnelly organized a search immediately. Claire insisted on joining. The sheriff objected. She ignored him. 10 minutes later, they descended together. The corridor stretched beneath the fairgrounds like the interior of some buried machine. Concrete walls disappeared into shadow beyond the reach of portable lights. Utility pipes ran overhead. Electrical conduits followed the ceiling. The distant sounds of the fair filtered downward through layers of earth as a constant low vibration. Music, crowds, machinery, life. The deeper they moved, the stronger the feeling became. Claire noticed it first. Then apparently others did as well. Several deputies glanced around uneasily. No one commented. No one needed to. The sensation was difficult to describe. The tunnel felt occupied. Not visually, emotionally, like entering a room moments after someone else had left. The impression lingered despite complete silence. The search continued. One corridor became another, then another. The tunnel maps stopped matching reality. Dead ends appeared where intersections should have existed. Passageways extended beyond their documented lengths. Utility routes diverged from engineering plans. More than once, the group stopped to compare maps against walls that stubbornly refused to exist where they were supposed to. Claire thought about Travis Boone. The tunnels don't always match. For years, she would have dismissed the statement. Now she wasn't sure. Then one of the deputies found the dirt. The soil covered the floor ahead. Fresh, dark, recently disturbed. Flashlights swept across the corridor. The mound extended around a corner and vanished from sight. Nobody moved immediately. The reaction felt instinctive, predatory. The same hesitation hikers experience when discovering large tracks in fresh snow. Evidence of presence changes a landscape. The tunnel no longer felt empty. Slowly, the group advanced. The corner approached. The soil thickened. The smell returned. Earth. Decay. Something organic hidden beneath the sterile scent of concrete and machinery. Claire felt her pulse quickening. The deputy reached the corner first. His flashlight crossed into the adjoining passage. Then stopped. For a moment nobody spoke. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds. When the deputy finally lowered the light, the expression on his face told Claire something had changed. Not another body. Something worse. Because for the first time since this began, they had found evidence not of where it had been, but where it was now. The passage beyond the corner was not on any map. That realization reached Claire before she fully processed what she was seeing. The corridor ahead should not have existed. Engineering plans identified a utility junction in that location. The wall facing them was supposed to be solid concrete, extending to the property boundary. Instead, the tunnel opened into a broad chamber whose dimensions disappeared beyond the reach of their lights. Nobody spoke. The silence felt involuntary. Human beings possess an instinctive understanding of construction. Even people with no engineering experience develop an unconscious sense of how buildings fit together. Walls belong somewhere. Foundations occupy predictable spaces. Underground rooms require reasons. The chamber violated those assumptions. The floor sloped gradually downward beneath a layer of dark earth. Concrete ended abruptly 20 feet from the entrance, giving way to exposed soil that appeared compacted and strangely smooth. The walls possessed a similar quality. Portions looked geological. Other sections looked worn, not carved, used. The distinction unsettled Claire immediately. The room resembled neither a cave nor a tunnel. It resembled a place through which something had traveled repeatedly for a very long time. One of the deputies stepped forward. His flashlight swept across the chamber. The beam illuminated scattered objects partially embedded in the soil. A shoe, a backpack, a rusted flashlight. something that might once have been a bicycle helmet. The light continued moving. More objects emerged from darkness: wallets, coolers, camping chairs, pieces of clothing, hundreds of items, perhaps thousands, accumulated over decades. The sight produced an immediate and inexplicable sadness in Claire. The objects felt strangely personal despite their anonymity. Every item represented someone: a trip, a family, a memory. Yet they had all ended up here together, buried beneath the fairgrounds like artifacts collected by a civilization that did not understand their purpose. No one needed to explain what they were looking at. The chamber was not a grave. It was a den. The word entered Claire's thoughts with such certainty that she almost recoiled from it. A den, a nesting area, a place something returned to. One of the deputies whispered a curse. Another slowly lowered his flashlight. Nobody wanted to continue forward. Unfortunately, everyone knew they had to. The missing maintenance worker might still be alive. The possibility seemed increasingly unlikely, but it remained a possibility. Donnelly signaled for the search to continue. The group moved cautiously into the chamber. Their lights drifted across the walls, across the floor, across the countless abandoned possessions half buried in the soil. The deeper they traveled, the more obvious the pattern became. The objects were not distributed randomly. They followed pathways. Narrow trails worn through the earth, the same trails that extended farther into darkness. The same trails something had apparently used for years, perhaps decades. Claire found herself studying the dimensions, the width, the spacing, the height of scuff marks visible along portions of the walls. The measurement suggested a creature considerably larger than she wanted to imagine. The thought remained abstract until one of the deputies stopped walking. His flashlight had settled upon a section of wall 20 yards ahead. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he quietly called Donnelly's name. Everyone gathered around. The wall bore scratches. Not the gouges discovered in the maintenance tunnels. These were fresher, clearer. The marks cut through compacted soil and exposed pale layers beneath. 4 parallel grooves, each nearly 6 feet long, each separated by several inches. Claire stared at them. The scale transformed everything. A person could not produce those marks. No known animal in the region could produce those marks. The scratches belonged to something powerful enough to move through earth the way ordinary predators moved through grass. Something adapted to digging. Something adapted to living below. The chamber suddenly felt much smaller. A faint vibration passed through the ground. Everyone felt it. This time there was no uncertainty. The soil beneath their boots trembled briefly before settling again. The reaction among the deputies was immediate. Flashlights shifted, heads turned. Several people instinctively stepped closer together. Another vibration followed. Slightly stronger. Not violent, rhythmic, deliberate. Claire's eyes moved toward the darkness beyond the chamber, toward the trails, toward the tunnels extending deeper beneath the property. A realization arrived with horrifying clarity. The vibrations were not random. Something was moving. Far away, but moving. The earth itself carried the information. One deputy quietly suggested leaving. Nobody argued. The missing worker was no longer the priority. Understanding what they had discovered suddenly seemed far more important. The group began retreating. Slowly at first, then faster. Nobody wanted to run. Running would acknowledge what every person present was already thinking. That they had entered the territory of something they did not understand. Halfway back to the concrete corridor, Claire glanced over her shoulder. The chamber remained motionless, silent, empty. Then her flashlight crossed a distant section of wall near the edge of visibility. Something reflected the light. 2 points. Brief. Gone immediately. Perhaps moisture. Perhaps mineral deposits. Perhaps nothing at all. Yet the sight remained with her all the way back to the surface. The fair continued operating above them. Music drifted across the grounds. Children laughed. Ride lights spun against the night sky. Families wandered the midway carrying prizes and food and souvenirs. The scent of popcorn and grilled meat floated through warm summer air. Vendors called out to passing crowds. Concerts continued. Fireworks launched from the western edge of the property. The contrast felt surreal. Beneath all of it existed a chamber large enough to contain generations of human belongings. Beneath all of it existed tunnels no engineer had documented. Beneath all of it, something large enough to carve 6-foot grooves into packed earth was moving through the darkness. Claire stood near the midway and watched the crowd flow around her. For years, she had viewed the fair as a triumph of organization, a temporary city requiring thousands of coordinated decisions. Every light, every ride, every food stand represented human effort overcoming complexity. Now, another possibility had emerged. Perhaps the fair was not something people had built. Perhaps people had simply become one of its components. The thought followed her gaze toward the center of the grounds, toward the oldest section, toward the place where attendance always seemed densest, where people tended to linger without realizing why, where Henry Pike had felt vibrations nearly 80 years earlier, where the earliest cavities had been discovered, and where, for reasons Claire was only beginning to understand, the crowd seemed to be growing thicker with every passing hour. Somewhere below, something had spent nearly a century adapting to the fair. The question keeping her awake now was whether the adaptation had finally reached its end, or whether it had only just begun. The next morning began with a meeting nobody wanted to attend. Claire sat at the head of a conference table while county officials, fair administrators, law enforcement representatives, and legal advisors attempted to discuss the previous night's discoveries without fully acknowledging them. The difficulty became apparent almost immediately. Every sentence seemed to require translation. The chamber became an unauthorized subsurface area. The missing worker became an ongoing personnel concern. The tunnel system became a structural issue. Language performed its usual function. It transformed frightening things into manageable categories. Unfortunately, the evidence resisted categorization. Sheriff Donnelly eventually placed several photographs on the table and allowed silence to do the work. The images showed the chamber, the trails, the discarded belongings, the claw marks. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the county attorney cleared his throat and asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "What exactly are we looking at?" Nobody answered, because the answer sounded ridiculous. Claire studied the faces around the table. These were practical people, accountants, administrators, public officials, people whose lives revolved around regulations, budgets, permits, contracts, and measurable outcomes. They did not possess a framework for discussing something that appeared to live beneath a county fair. The meeting dissolved into familiar arguments, liability concerns, public relations concerns, financial concerns. Someone suggested restricting access to portions of the property. Someone else pointed out that attendance records were already being broken. Another reminded the group that closing sections of the fair would generate panic if no explanation accompanied the decision. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Nothing meaningful was accomplished. By the end, Claire understood something that Henry Pike, Frank Harlan, and every previous generation had probably discovered for themselves. The fair had become too important. Not economically. Psychologically. The county no longer viewed the fair as an event. The county viewed the fair as part of reality. Questioning it felt unnatural, like questioning weather or gravity, or the changing of seasons. People would rather invent explanations than challenge something that fundamental. The realization followed Claire outside. Crowds already filled the midway despite the early hour. Music drifted from speakers. Vendors prepared food. Families moved between attractions. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of a successful fair. And everywhere she looked, she felt the growing pressure of an invisible contradiction. The fair was functioning perfectly. Something beneath it was functioning perfectly. The two systems appeared connected. The breakthrough arrived shortly after noon. Not through archaeology, not through engineering, through cellular data. One of the sheriff's investigators had become curious about the missing persons. Specifically, he wanted to know whether any common pattern existed among individuals who disappeared near the fairgrounds. The results initially seemed unremarkable. Then he mapped their movements. Claire received the call while inspecting a livestock pavilion. 20 minutes later, she stood in front of a large monitor inside the sheriff's mobile command center. A digital map filled the screen. Colored lines crossed the property. Attendance data. Phone signals. Movement patterns. Thousands upon thousands of visitors. At first, the display resembled exactly what one would expect from a crowded event. Then the investigator activated another layer. A dense cluster appeared near the center of the grounds. The oldest section. The midway. The same location identified repeatedly throughout the archives. "What am I looking at?" Claire asked. The investigator zoomed in. The cluster remained, even as individual movement patterns changed, even as crowds shifted, even as people came and went. A persistent concentration remained centered on the same area. "We thought it was normal crowd behavior." The investigator sounded uneasy. Then we compared previous years. More maps appeared. Different years, different attendance levels, different technologies. The cluster remained identical. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The concentration existed regardless of crowd size, regardless of weather, regardless of attraction placement. People naturally gravitated toward the same location every year, not because anything important was there, because something was drawing them there. The investigator zoomed out, then farther. The screen expanded to include portions of the county, then neighboring counties, then surrounding states. Additional data appeared. Search trends, reservation patterns, travel routes, online activity. The pattern repeated at every scale. Convergence. The farther Claire looked, the more obvious it became. People were not merely attending the fair. People were moving toward it. The distinction felt enormous. Terrifying. The fairgrounds occupied the center of a behavioral phenomenon extending across much of the country. A pressure gradient, a migration route, a call. Henry Pike's final notebook entry surfaced immediately in her thoughts. "I think the fair is calling something. I am beginning to suspect it is being answered." For nearly 80 years, everyone had interpreted the sentence incorrectly. The fair wasn't calling anything. Something else was. The fair simply amplified it. The attack occurred shortly before sunset. This time there were witnesses, many of them. The incident began near the livestock exhibition area, where several hundred people were gathered for an evening competition. Security footage later showed a brief disturbance moving through the crowd. Heads turned. Conversations paused. A small number of people began walking toward a maintenance gate normally restricted to employees. No one appeared alarmed. Quite the opposite. They looked curious, interested. The behavior lasted only seconds before shouting erupted nearby. Then, panic followed. Witness accounts varied dramatically. Some described seeing an animal. Others described a person. Several insisted they had seen nothing at all. The only consistent detail involved size. Whatever moved through the crowd had been impossibly large. The attack itself lasted less than 10 seconds. A maintenance worker disappeared. 3 spectators were injured. By the time security personnel reached the area, the service corridor beyond the gate stood empty. The crowd, however, continued staring towards the darkness beyond the entrance, not frightened, drawn. The sight disturbed Claire more than the attack itself. Predators were understandable. Predators hunted. Predators killed. What she saw in the faces of those spectators was something different. Longing. The same expression she had observed on the woman standing motionless in the midway. The same expression described by the missing man from Missouri. The same expression scattered throughout decades of survey responses and witness accounts. People wanted to move toward it, even after watching it take someone. That realization changed everything. Because predators usually hide. Predators avoid attention. Predators do not spend nearly a century teaching their prey to approach willingly. As emergency vehicles converged on the scene and frightened crowds began retreating from the area, Claire found herself staring toward the maintenance gate, toward the darkness beyond it, toward the old ground beneath the fair. And for the first time she understood that the creature's greatest adaptation was not physical, not its size, not its strength, not its ability to move beneath the earth. Its greatest adaptation was that it had convinced generations of people it was something they had always wanted to find. Claire did not sleep that night. By midnight, the county had entered the first stage of denial. Officially, a dangerous animal was believed to be present on the property. The explanation spread quickly because it possessed the comforting shape of a problem people already understood. Dangerous animals existed. They occasionally wandered into developed areas. Wildlife officers handled such situations. Procedures existed. Resources existed. Solutions existed. The explanation survived precisely because it was inadequate. No one wanted to discuss the alternative. No one wanted to discuss the fact that a dangerous animal did not explain attendance records stretching back generations. It did not explain missing persons from multiple states. It did not explain behavioral patterns, tunnel systems, ground vibrations, or the strange attraction people experienced near the oldest sections of the fairgrounds. The animal explanation functioned as a temporary shelter from a larger realization. Something beneath the fair had become part of the fair. The two could no longer be separated. Around 2 a.m, Claire returned to the Midway. The decision felt irrational. The sheriff had restricted access to several sections of the property. Additional security patrols monitored maintenance entrances. Emergency meetings continued behind closed doors. Every sensible part of her mind argued that she should be elsewhere. Instead, she found herself walking alone through the oldest section of the grounds. The fair looked different after closing. Without crowds, the Midway revealed its age. Rides stood silent beneath work lights. Empty food stands resembled abandoned storefronts. Loose paper drifted across pavement. Music had vanished, leaving only distant generators and the occasional metallic creak of machinery settling as temperatures cooled. The place felt suspended between identities. Not quite an attraction. Not quite a construction site. Something older, something waiting. Claire stopped near the center of the grounds. The same location appeared repeatedly throughout historical reports. The same location where visitors tended to gather. The same location where density maps reached their highest concentrations. For a long time she stood there listening. Nothing happened. The silence gradually deepened. Then she noticed a sound. Not a vibration, not exactly, a frequency. too low to register as hearing and too persistent to ignore completely. The sensation occupied an uncomfortable space between sound and pressure. She felt it more than heard it. A faint awareness settled behind her eyes and along the bones of her face. The experience lasted only moments. Yet during those moments, an unexpected memory surfaced. Her father teaching her to ride a bicycle, the smell of summer grass, the feeling of returning home after college, the first apartment she had ever rented. The memory appeared without context and vanished just as quickly. Another followed, then another. The sequence disturbed her because none of the memories shared any obvious connection. Except one. Each represented a place she had wanted to return to. A place associated with safety, belonging, arrival. The realization struck with such force that she physically stepped backward. The creature wasn't creating desire. It was borrowing it. Every witness description suddenly made sense. Familiar, comforting, important. The feeling did not originate from the creature itself. The creature reflected something already present within the victim. It transformed longing into a lure. The biological elegance of the adaptation horrified her, because it explained how a predator could attract intelligent prey repeatedly across generations. People weren't being compelled. People were being invited. The first complete footage arrived shortly before dawn. A security camera mounted above a maintenance entrance had captured several seconds of usable video before the attack. Claire watched the recording alongside Sheriff Donnelly and 3 investigators. Nobody spoke. The footage began normally. Crowds moved through the livestock area. Employees crossed service roads. Families gathered near exhibition buildings. Then movement appeared near the edge of the frame. At first, Claire failed to understand what she was seeing. The creature blended with the environment almost perfectly. Not through camouflage, through expectation. The mind interpreted portions of its body as shadows, fencing, maintenance equipment, and structural supports because those explanations felt more reasonable than the truth. Only when it crossed open ground did its shape become clear. The creature moved on 4 limbs. Its proportions looked profoundly wrong. The forelimbs appeared longer than the rear limbs, creating a posture that reminded Claire of something evolved for digging rather than running. Pale skin stretched across a frame far larger than any known predator in the region. Portions of the body seemed almost unfinished, lacking pigmentation and obvious features. The head remained lowered throughout most of the recording. Then it turned. The room became completely silent. The face possessed no visible eyes, no obvious ears, no recognizable expression. Instead, the front of the skull opened into a broad, ribbed structure, resembling layers of pale cartilage folded inward upon themselves. The anatomy looked less like a mouth than a biological instrument, an organ, something designed to produce rather than consume. The footage lasted 7 seconds. The creature crossed the frame. Several people began following. The attack occurred beyond camera range. Then the recording ended. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Donnelly leaned back in his chair. "What the hell is that?" No one answered, because no answer existed. The creature did not resemble folklore. It did not resemble mythology. It looked biological, real, the product of adaptation rather than imagination. And somehow that made it worse. A monster belonged to stories. An animal belonged to the world. The county ordered the fair closed shortly after sunrise. The announcement triggered immediate outrage. Business owners protested. Vendors threatened legal action. Visitors demanded refunds. Local news stations questioned the decision. Social media exploded with speculation. The reaction unfolded exactly as Claire expected. People did not want the fair to end. Even now, even after the attacks, even after the discoveries. The resistance felt irrational until she realized it wasn't entirely economic. Many people genuinely wanted to stay. The same attraction remained active. The same pressure continued operating beneath conscious thought. As evacuation efforts began, traffic reports revealed something disturbing. Large numbers of visitors were not leaving. They lingered. Campgrounds remained occupied. Parking lots remained partially full. People wandered the grounds despite repeated announcements. Some simply sat and stared toward the center midway, waiting. The sight reminded Claire of migratory birds gathering before a seasonal movement. Not trapped, not forced, drawn. By late afternoon, she finally accepted the truth. The creature was not responding to the fair anymore. The fair had reached the stage Henry Pike warned about decades earlier. Fair Week changes it. The event was no longer feeding the organism. The event was transforming it. And somewhere beneath the oldest part of the property, beneath nearly a century of construction, prosperity, expansion, and human activity, something was preparing to emerge fully into the world above. For the first time since the investigation began, Claire suspected that everything they had witnessed so far, every disappearance, every chamber, every tunnel, every attack, might represent only the early stages of a process that had not yet completed itself. The truly frightening part was not that the creature had spent a century adapting to the fair. The truly frightening part was that the adaptation appeared to be working. The answer was buried inside the oldest construction report ever produced for the fairgrounds. Not because someone had understood what they were seeing, because someone had measured it. 3 days after the closure order, while most of the county argued about lost revenue and public safety, Claire sat alone in the courthouse archive, reviewing documents nobody had touched in generations. By then, the fairgrounds had been largely evacuated. State authorities controlled access points. Wildlife specialists, geologists, engineers, and federal agencies had all become involved. The arrival of expertise had produced remarkably little clarity. Everyone agreed something existed beneath the property. Nobody agreed what it was. Claire no longer believed classification mattered. The important question was not what the creature was. The important question was what it was doing. The answer emerged from a yellowed survey map dated 1942. The document itself appeared unremarkable. Measurements, excavation notes, soil conditions. Yet one sketch captured her attention immediately. A construction foreman had attempted to outline the cavity discovered during the original collapse beneath the midway. The drawing was crude, but the shape felt familiar. Claire spread newer maps beside it. Then tunnel surveys. Then the modern chamber diagrams. The resemblance became impossible to ignore. The original cavity was not separate from the current network. It was the current network. A smaller version. The realization struck with such force that she stopped breathing for a moment. The tunnels had not been excavated. They had expanded. For nearly a century, every generation had mistaken growth for geography. Every new collapse revealed a larger system because the system itself was becoming larger. Henry Pike had understood this decades ago. Growth appears directional. The note suddenly felt less like speculation and more like observation. The organism had been growing outward from a central structure buried beneath the midway. Not randomly, purposefully, like roots, like blood vessels, like a body constructing something. Claire drove directly to the fairgrounds. The property stood eerily quiet. Rides remained motionless. Vendor booths sat abandoned. Wind moved loose trash across empty walkways. Without crowds, the grounds felt strangely exposed, as though some essential component had been removed. She found Sheriff Donnelly near the command center. 20 minutes later, they were underground. The chamber had become a hive of activity. Portable lighting illuminated pathways through the accumulated debris. Engineers conducted measurements. Survey teams mapped tunnel routes. Equipment operators prepared drilling rigs near several strategic locations. Everyone assumed they were searching for the creature. Claire wasn't. She was searching for the center. The old maps suggested one existed. Every pathway converged. Every tunnel radiated outward. Every historical incident clustered around the same location. Something sat beneath the midpoint of the fairgrounds. Something old. Something important. It took nearly 4 hours to reach it. The deeper sections of the network extended far beyond anything previously imagined. Portions descended through compacted earth that appeared polished from repeated use. Other areas widened into enormous chambers where discarded human objects formed geological layers of their own. Decades of accumulation surrounded them. Wallets, coolers, shoes, photographs, jewelry, ticket stubs, toys, clothing, entire lives reduced to traces. The sight reminded Claire of sedimentary rock. Human presence compressed into strata. The oldest layers occupied the deepest sections. The newest remained closer to the surface. A century of feeding. A century of growth. Then they reached the center. The chamber dwarfed everything they had previously encountered. The ceiling vanished into darkness beyond the reach of industrial floodlights. Massive columns of compacted earth supported the surrounding structure. Trails converged from every direction before disappearing into a circular depression occupying the center of the chamber floor. No one spoke. The scale made language feel inadequate. The depression measured nearly 50 feet across. At first, Claire thought it was empty. Then she understood what she was seeing. The creature wasn't living in the depression. The creature was the depression. Its body filled the entire structure. Most of it remained buried. Only portions were visible. Pale surfaces emerged from the surrounding earth like exposed sections of some enormous fossil. Vast folds of tissue disappeared beneath packed soil. Ribbed structures extended outward through the chamber walls and into the tunnel network beyond. What everyone had interpreted as separate features now revealed themselves as components of a single organism. The tunnels, the chambers, the pathways, the vibrations, all connected, all alive. The realization settled over the group with terrible clarity. The predator recorded on security footage was not the organism itself. It was a reproductive form, a mobile extension, a worker, something produced by the larger structure buried beneath the fairgrounds. Claire finally understood the fair. The crowds, the attraction, the growth. The fair had never been feeding a predator. The fair had been feeding a colony. And the colony had spent nearly a century reaching maturity. One of the engineers whispered something. Nobody responded, because movement had begun. The depression trembled, then trembled again. The vibration rolled through the chamber floor and into the surrounding walls. Dust drifted from overhead surfaces. Equipment alarms activated throughout the cavern. The entire structure was waking. Not awakening, transitioning, like a seed reaching the end of dormancy. Like an egg reaching the end of incubation, the process had already begun. Claire looked upward, towards the fairgrounds, toward the midway, toward the place where generations of people had unknowingly supplied exactly what the organism required. Noise, movement, density, energy. The fair had become part of its life cycle, and if the process completed, the colony would not remain confined to Ashe County. The attraction radius was already expanding. Attendance records proved that. People traveled from farther away every year because the signal itself was becoming stronger. The fair wasn't a destination. It was a beacon, and sooner or later other colonies would follow. The decision took less than a minute. Explaining it took longer. The county resisted. Business owners resisted. Politicians resisted. Everyone resisted. Because destroying the fair meant destroying the county. There was no version of the future where both survived. Yet eventually, the evidence became undeniable. By nightfall, demolition charges were being lowered into the deepest sections of the network. Engineers argued the explosions might fail. Biologists argued they did not understand enough. Lawyers argued about liability. Claire listened to none of them. For nearly a century, every generation had chosen prosperity. Every generation had chosen not to look. Someone had to choose differently. The detonations began shortly after midnight. The first explosion shook windows throughout the county. The second collapsed several major chambers. The third triggered a chain reaction extending through the oldest sections of the network. The ground moved. Not violently, not dramatically. The motion felt strangely organic, like a body reacting to injury. Then came the sound. People reported hearing it across the county. Some described a distant siren. Others described music. Many later struggled to describe it at all. The sound lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet everyone who heard it remembered the same feeling. Loss, not fear, not relief. Loss. As though something that had always existed had suddenly disappeared. The ground settled. The vibrations stopped. And for the first time in living memory, Ashe County became quiet. The following year, attendance collapsed. Then it collapsed again. Then again. Hotels closed. Restaurants failed. Businesses relocated. Tourism revenue evaporated. The county survived. But survival looked different than it had before. Smaller, harder, real. People spent years arguing about what had happened. Most explanations sounded reasonable: economic changes, negative publicity, cultural shifts, changing travel habits. No single explanation proved satisfactory. Eventually, the arguments faded. Life continued. It always does. 10 years later, Claire stood near the center of the former Midway. Most of the rides were gone. Large sections of the property had been converted back into open land. Wind moved through tall grass where crowds once gathered. The county still hosted a small annual fair, but the event resembled what it had probably been before prosperity transformed it into something larger. Local, ordinary, human. The quiet felt unfamiliar. Then again, perhaps the quiet had always been there. Perhaps people simply hadn't noticed. Claire looked across the empty field and thought about Henry Pike, who had come closer than anyone to understanding the truth. The fair had indeed been calling something. It just hadn't been calling the creature. The creature had been calling them. For nearly a century, people had mistaken the feeling for excitement, tradition, nostalgia, opportunity, ambition, community, and hope. They had built businesses around it, built identities around it, built an entire county around it. In the end, that was the most frightening realization of all. The organism beneath the fairgrounds had not survived because it was stronger than human beings. It had survived because it understood them. And because, for a very long time, it gave them exactly what they wanted. This was Ashe County Fair, created and composed by Mark Stephen Nordlund, Boohousebooks.com. Collection paperbacks of these stories are available everywhere books are sold online. Get free early access to these stories by visiting patreon.com/boohousebooks.